seems to me that the civilizational crisis of 1914 to 1945 was interpreted by many, both prior to the war and certainly after the war, as a consequence of the strong gods and the role of the strong gods in public life. And that the imperative for those who cared about the future of Western civilization was to drive the strong gods out of public life and to engage in strategic weakening of public loyalties in order to promote cooperation and peace. And this is, I think, the idea behind the European economic community, the early stages of the EU, the predecessor initiatives of the EU, is that the softening role of commercial relations, that commercial relations will create a kind of harmony of interests, and that the strong loyalties that often galvanize men to sacrifice their self-interest for the sake of the common project, that impulse can be weakened if we heighten people's self-interest in commercial cooperation. So that was obviously one instance, and human rights is another instance of the strategy of weakening. For most Americans, I think, are not aware that in the European context, especially in the German context, human rights was identified as a way to limit the power of the state. And we have a constitution which we recognize to be a political act of self-limitation. But in the aftermath of World War II, there was a felt need to identify a kind of even higher power that would then limit and constrain what is possible in the political realm. And that was another strategy of weakening. So we enter into the post-war era, what I call an era of weakening. And I think Josh Mitchell might argue that for someone like Tocqueville recognized that the democratic project as a whole is a weakening project, a weakening of the links that bind men and women together. But it really took off in the 1960s when it wasn't just we needed to have a weakening of the strong gods in order to ensure that Europeans no longer go to war with each other, but we have to weaken strong gods so that we all have more room to breathe as individuals and we can realize our true potential and live authentic lives. And so it really picked up steam in the 1960s, the notion of weakening. And then in 1989, the last, if you will, consolidating force in the Western political, and the imagination of people in the West collapsed. And so this released a great deal of residual energy towards consolidation, that we had to steel ourselves in unity to face an existential enemy. And so after 1989, the West faced no existential enemy. And so the impulse towards weakening could move forward unimpeded. And I've come to realize that things like the dictatorship of relativism that Pope Benedict made famous in his funeral speech for John Paul II, that the dictatorship of relativism ministers to the ideal of weakening. No one is a thoroughgoing relativist in my experience, but instead it's a therapy that we apply to young people in order to soften their loyalties and commitments so that they will be more tolerant towards others, and so that we can, if you will, expand the circle of inclusion. And so multiculturalism also, I think, is a technique or therapy of weakening. That's my sense of what the post-war era is characterized. And this young man, when he asked to live to see the end of the 20th century, I think what he wants to live to see the end of the era of weakening. And in a paper that we circulated, I identified technology. There are many other areas of where we have a public theology, if you will, of the beneficent consequences of this pattern of weakening. That this is going to make the world a better place, going to usher in a utopia of perpetual peace. But it's pretty clear from electoral results in Europe and now in the United States is that ordinary people are rebelling against the patterns of weakening, and they want the strong gods to return to public life. And so I think that the challenge that we face is to recognize the return of the strong gods, and to try to lead this impulse to restore the strong gods. Because if we don't lead it, it will in fact have, I think, very perverse implications. So that the strong gods are returning, and I think, as a Christian of Anglo-Saxon descent, that's not something that I'm terribly anxious about personally. But if I was Jewish, I'd be very worried about the return of the strong gods to public life in the West. So not that I would resist it, because the pattern of weakening has become an enemy of the state of Israel in the last 2 decades, because the recalcitrance of the Jewish people and the insistence of Jews that sort of modern cosmopolitanism be damned, we are going to be a people. So Jews are in a very difficult position as compared to Christians in this storm in which we're in. And I think, therefore, actually perhaps have a very important role to play in providing leadership for this moment, both to be loyal to and to be both loyal to something that is particular, that is simply a given, to which is what sanctifies life. That the givenness of being Jewish is what is the source of sanctification, not just of the Jewish people, but of the entire human race. That this impulse of loyalty, with a historical experience of the perversions of the strong gods, I think will be a very powerful combination and a needed voice. It seems to me that the purpose of culture, the reason why the strong gods are returning, is because the purpose of culture is to provide people with a home. And that the problem with the pattern of weakening is that it has made people homeless. And I was at a meeting of conservative intellectuals in Europe, all 12 of them, and a young woman gave a very passionate speech about immigration, and she said that the Muslims in the neighborhood where she lived went back to Algeria and Morocco, and there's an Arabic term for home, and they go back home. They talk about it for a couple of weeks in the summer, they go home. And she said, their voice quavering, "If I lose France, where can I go?" And I was dumbfounded by that sentiment, thinking this is when I realized how what we're going to experience now in the coming years. This is a powerful emotion. It's a fundamental emotion that will rock any political society where it's felt acutely. The sense that one's home is lost and one's being cast into life with no home. And so this is the central purpose of culture. Everyone desires Sabbath rest. And the givenness of things, their solidity, their permanence, and their sheer givenness is what provides us with rest. We don't want to argue for everything. We don't want to defend everything. And if we have to, I think then we're offered no rest. And one function of patria, the sense of being native born to a place, is that feeling of rest, that there's something that's simply given that we don't have to justify, defend, or provide a rationale for. We may have to defend it in the sense of defend its existence, but we don't have to defend it intellectually or morally or even theologically. And so this power of the given to provide rest, I think, is something that we need to recognize. And so the kind of conservatism that I think we need to look as we face this storm into which we're in, which that young woman, like I say, made me realize that she said that France is on the brink of civil war. I was real taken. I thought that was kind of French hyperbole. And then she made her comment about how she may not even have a home anymore. And I think, whoa, we shouldn't underestimate. Again, this is a very dangerous emotion to be pushed to the brink like that. So it seems to me that our task is to encourage people's desire for home. That it is a curse to curse someone to be Cain and to wander without a home. It strikes me as not something that we should ally ourselves. We should not ally ourselves with forces that want to resist the perversions of this desire for home. We should not ally ourselves with them in a way that condemns people to be homeless. But nevertheless, we have to guide and purify this desire for a home, for people to have a home, because it will take on perverse forms. And I think that there are two ways, and I'll conclude with that. There are two dimensions to this. I think that the family is a more, in the ontology of the Bible, there are two permanent. I mean, you know that there are two forms of social relation that are permanent. They are the union of the man and the woman in Genesis 2, and they are the people called by God and the covenant. But those are two forms of unity that have a kind of divinely instituted integrity. The nation is an ambiguous. It's like private property. I think it comes from Babel, where God offers it. God provides the nation as an ordinance for the sustaining of human life in this interim, in our fallen condition, in the interim between the defilement of creation and its final perfection at the end. So it's a more ambiguous status. But the family below the nation pinions the nation and limits it. I think if you did a sociological, I haven't done it, but if you did a study of people in the SA, Hitler's SA, I bet you that the majority of them were unmarried men. So marriage is a kind of deeper loyalty that can limit patriotism and prevent its perversion. And then, of course, the church and the synagogue from above. So faith and family as two more powerful loyalties that can purify the natural impulse towards loyalty to one's own people and place.